Every year, we have a talented group of Japanese professional ball players that come over to the major leagues. And the biggest question is always how are they going to perform when they come over? And first year player drafts are often taken very early. However, in redraft leagues, you might be able to get a great value because they can be pretty hard to predict. So if you already subscribed to this channel, you know I'm going to show you all the data that we have available to make these decisions to try to project where we should actually rank these players that are coming over this year to see if we can find some value for our fantasy teams. The first player I'm actually really excited about, I think has the most high-end upside and also the most potential to return a good value for your team, is Kazuma Okamoto, who was signed with the Toronto Blue Jays. I think he's going to be, when he first came over, Murakami, who we'll talk about, had all the press and so forth. However, Okamoto has, you'll see, a little more overall talented skills, even though he is going to be in his age 30. He's 29 already, and he'll be 30 by the middle of this season. So therefore, I think some people in your leagues may actually kind of fade him a little bit or avoid him, especially in dynasty leagues. But I'm going to walk you through. I think he has lots of potential. So first, looking at the data we have available, we obviously don't have a lot of projectable StatCast data that we can look at like we do with other prospects, but we can treat them like a prospect. So on Fangraphs, they do rate them with a 50 hit tool, 55 game power, 55 raw power. So he has, really good tools that can play. So he's not going to hurt you in any of those categories. He's not going to give you anything for speed, and his fielding might be a little bit subpar, but I think third base is relatively weak this year. So I think he has a good shot of rising up the third base rankings, as you'll see. He signed with Toronto for 4 years, so I think that hopefully I think that's a team that's obviously invested a lot this offseason, so that could be an improving lineup for him. Now, you can see while he was over in Japan professional leagues, he hit between 30 to 40 home runs a year. He had very good high walk rates with relatively low strikeout rates and fantastic WRC pluses, probably averaging in 150s. But you can see here, even last year, he had a 210 WRC plus in limited games because he ended up getting injured. So when you try to project this and see how he will do in the majors, it can be a little tricky. But a lot of the projections you see here have a mid-20s home runs, 70s, maybe 80 to 90 RBIs, if they're being kind, but still projecting overall good walk rates and really low strikeout rates. So I think based on a lot of these projections, you can see his on-base percentage won't hurt you, but his slugging will be mid-400s. So on average, he's kind of close to that 800 OPS overall, which is, I think, can play in some of our third base leagues. And I think of anybody here, he has the most upside to actually exceed the projections that we'll have. Now let's look at where he's going in some drafts. Actually, one of the things that really convinced me that I've been interested in him is looking back on the 2023 World Baseball Classic data. So again, it's small base size, only 7 games, but if you're a little bit concerned about how someone's game will translate to the majors, the World Baseball Classic is a pretty good, even though low base size, to look at that because you're playing against some of the most talented players from all over the world. And of course, Japan had an absolutely amazing team that won the championship last time, but in just 7 games, Okamoto had a 1278 OPS. He didn't only strike out 4 times in 7 games. He had 2 home runs, and he walked 8 times against some of the top talented players in the world. You can see Shohei Ohtani also performed similarly well with just slightly higher OPS and a little more walks. So I think that bodes really well for Okamoto against that talent. And we'll talk about a little bit later about Murakami. His data wasn't as strong in the World Baseball Classic. So I think you have a history of production over in Japan, along with a history of still producing, even in short base size, in the World Baseball Classic. So now let's look at where he's getting drafted. So he has been rising up in the drafts. He's now in most recent drafts, starting in February, he's getting drafted near 200 overall. But overall, it's been kind of up and down and so forth. And when you look at the overall rankings, even the most recent drafts, he's ranked as the 26th third baseman out there, which I think is really low. So I think people just aren't exactly sure how he'll translate his game coming over here. But I think there's a ton of upside and value for this. And I feel like this is way too low of a ranking. You can see he's even ranked below Murakami for third baseman, which I think is a crime, even though Murakami is getting more press because he's younger and he had the all-time home run record over in Japan. But I think of everyone on this list, Okamoto couldn't return the highest return investment for you, especially depending on where you can get him in your drafts. So now let's take a look at this. I think one of the fair comps for him, if you look at the projections for Okamoto, it looks to me like this fairly someone who's like Jazz Chisholm, just without the steals. So ignoring the stolen bases, he's not going to have that part of his game. But you can see here, mid 20s, upper 20s potential, pretty good 70 to 80, maybe 90 RBIs. And then, OPS that can be kind of near 800. And you can see WRC plus of 110 to 120, which is kind of what they're projecting for Okamoto as well. But I think he has a chance to exceed this upside potential because of how well he's done in the World Baseball Classic with the small base size, and the fact that his overall game, there's almost no flaw. Like the walk rate, the strikeout rate is low. As long as he can translate that to the U.S. game, I think he has a good chance of exceeding that production. Let's take a look at, I think, more reasonable, trying to figure out where to rank him. Let's compare him to, say, someone like Matt Chapman. Matt Chapman's also going to have, mid-20s, up as high as 30, home run potential in his rankings. He's also going to have, 80, maybe 90 runs and RBIs each. His walk rate's going to be decent with his K rate in the mid 20s and so forth, with an on base percentage that's not going to hurt you, and a good decent mid 400 slugging percentage. And WRC plus, it can be somewhere near 120, some as high as 124. So I feel like that's a good base case for like what the upside potential could be with Okamoto, and that's why in my overall rankings, how I see them for if you're drafting purely on just third baseman, I would kind of have them maybe potentially ahead of Chapman, especially with Chapman in San Francisco, which can cap some of the benefits of the player. So I would personally view Okamoto as a potential top 10 third baseman. You might trust him more than the younger guys like Westberg, Noelvi Marte, or Matt Chapman. If you want to put him right behind him, that's fine too. But I think just based on the pure projections of what we have right now, I would have him around the top 10 third baseman in the league, especially with third base kind of being not as deep as it used to be. And then I think if there's any upside with him, to outproduce that, then you'll just have bank that return on investment for wherever you pick them. So I think if people are thinking about him in the 20s as a third baseman, or even you can see a lot of these players on the call it top 150, 160 picks. If people are really thinking of him still even only like 200th pick overall, and he could return the performance of people near like 150 or 130 if he could break into the top 10, I think this is someone you want to think about, especially if you can get him a little bit later and have him be not a second berth third baseman. If your league has a corner infield spot that can be occupied by an additional first baseman or third baseman, I think that is a perfect spot to take a look at Okamoto, and I think you really need to have him high on his list. At first, I thought he was going to kind of be a little bit of a sleeper with the others getting the attention, but I think now you can see him rising in the drafts. He's starting to get the attention he deserves because I think he has the most well-rounded game that could project to the major leagues when he's coming, and he's definitely proven in the World Baseball Classic. Now, next, let's look at Murakami. If we don't treat him as a prospect, he has a questionable hit tool, which they're rating a 30 hit tool, well below average. But he has tremendous power, 70 game power, 80 raw power. He's not going to get a whole lot for speed, and he might be a liability as well. He's listed as a third baseman. We'll see how the White Sox treat him. Maybe play some first and some third around the corners, but we'll have to see how that does. And he is currently, not really rising up as fast as Okamoto, but still also he was started out a little bit higher, and now he's around that 200 pick mark as well. But as we look through his data, you'll see that there are probably more downside. He has so much upside potential for the power with that 70 game power and 80 raw power, but that hit tool is really what's concerning. And I'll show you. So he had some weakness over in Japan, and if any of that carries over to the U.S., there's some huge downside potential for him. So you can see here over in Japan, he had, 30, 40, even broke the record 56 home runs in 2022. However, even while he was over, and then 30s after that, even while I was over there, his strikeout rate was quite high, early in the 30s early in his career, and even creeping up 28, 29%, near 30 here each of the last 3 years. He's been able to make it work over there with the WRC plus in the 150s, even 200 as of last year. But the question's going to be is, how is that going to translate to the U.S.? And you can see a lot of the Fangraphs projections of him have him around 30 home run potential, so certainly has the power upside, but maybe capped at 70, 80 runs and RBIs. His walk rate should be fine, but they are predicting him here to over 30%, maybe even potentially mid 30s. Some of these Bad X ones have him like high 30. I really don't see a world where if you're carrying an almost 38% strikeout rate and you still manage 31 home runs, that you can manage to produce 80 or so RBIs. That seems like a very difficult line. If your strikeout rate is truly that high, you might not get the playing time that you expect. So I think with this profile, the home run potential is real. However, the downside risk of his strikeout rate is really, really high, that I think it is a warning flag. And that's why I think even Okamoto, even though his home run potential isn't as high, he was just a 55 game power. I think he is the safer bet to actually reach some of that potential because his game is more well-rounded, and I think that's going to translate better to the majors. And I think just now knowing where they've signed, I think even if they both hit their potential, I think the Toronto lineup is going to be much more favorable and conducive to producing runs and counting stats than the Chicago White Sox, who are improving but still in the process of rebuilding. So now let's take a look at where what he did in the World Baseball Classic. You can see Murakami here. He only had an 826 OPS. He only batted 231, but most alarming to me, if you're worried about that strikeout rate, is in 7 games against some of the top talent in the world, he struck out 13 times. So that leads me to believe that there is a strikeout concern with him, and then some of the top talent in the world is taking advantage of that. You can't strike out almost 2 times per game against the top talent in the world and expect to have significant success in the majors. So that is really the watch out. He did have a good fair amount of walks with that as well. So he, I'd say in that scenario, you're kind of hoping for like a Carl Schwarber, outcome with a really low batting average. If you're in a batting average league, that may really hurt you, but his on-base percentage might be okay if you play in an on-base percentage league. Now let's see what that looks like for him in some of his rankings. He's currently going as the 16th overall third baseman, which I think also makes it a crime that Okamoto is in the 20s right now. You can see he's just behind Matt Shaw, Isaac Paredes, Royce Lewis, and if you want to treat him as a first baseman, he's listed way below some of these players here, but like, where's the right place to slot him? I feel like maybe the potential upside, if he can actually reach it, maybe he falls in the top 13 third baseman, maybe behind Barger, if he can limit the strikeout rates and stay healthy, just because it depends on how much you trust Royce Lewis to stay healthy, or Matt Shaw to actually produce the potential he has in the minors and has yet to show in the majors. So I feel like, and even Paredes is kind of capped out around 20-ish or so home runs. So I feel like that's, if his upside is fair to say, he could probably get close to that Matt Barger range. But the downside risk is tremendously much lower than this. And as a first baseman, I would certainly have him below Michael Busch, first base only. And the question is, do you like him or trust him more than Yandy Diaz, Aranda, or Alec Burleson? Probably hard to make a case against Aranda if he repeats kind of what he did last year. So that's kind of how I see it for Murakami, where he has way more upside potential, but the odds of really achieving that is much more risky for the strikeout rate. And there aren't a whole lot of promising signs I've seen from the World Baseball Classic data that suggests he's going to be able to make the adjustments pretty quickly. So he may have a hard time adjusting or reaching that potential if he's striking out as much as he is. So now let's look at the third player kind of coming over, and this is Tatsuya Imai, the best pitcher that's kind of coming over. He has, rated as a 55 fastball with 60 upside potential or future value, 55 slider that could be a 60, 40 changeup that could be a 50, 40 splitter could be a 55, and his command is 40 to 45. So overall, that is a fairly average profile that's looking. And you can see here again in the NFPB data, he's getting drafted. He was peaking around 200 and below 200. Now he's kind of drifting back around 200 or just higher. I think one of the struggles that people don't know with all these talented Japanese pitchers that are coming over is compared to the hitters, where you could try to say, okay, well, what's their home run rate or what's their walk rate and their strikeout rate. With some of the pitchers, it's hard to really gauge how their stuff and how their pitches will translate, because sometimes they have movements that are unique to Japan that just don't translate. So in Imai's case, he has a slider that actually breaks the opposite direction. So it is super effective for him while he's over in Japan. How people are wondering how that's going to translate to the majors, if that's really going to continue to show him some success. So now let's take a look at his stats when he was in Japan. So you can see, while I was in Japan, he had a really good strikeout per 9 rate that got up above 9 the last few years. His walk rate has been a little bit higher, but he's been actually lowering that a little bit. It was as high as 5s just a few years ago, but he got it down to almost 2.5 this past year, which he really would need to do in order to worry about the whip for our fantasy leagues. And his ground ball rate's actually tremendous. He's getting 48% ground balls. So you can see his ERA has been coming down to low 2s, even 1.92 in the past year, even with his FIP being in that area. So I think that's why people are kind of excited about the potential. But when you look at the projections trying to figure out what to do with that, they do expect the strikeout rate to drop a little bit to the mid-8s per 9, which is still decent. And then like a pretty average 3.5-ish range for walks per 9, which is, you'd like to see that a lot lower. That's really quite average for majors. And you can see here's the ERA they're predicting is not great. It's over 4. In most cases, when you're talking about fantasy league where you need a below 3.5 ERA to really compete, or potentially even as low as like 3.1 to actually win your league, this is not a really huge fantasy asset for your team. And if his walk rate is that high, his whip might be hurting you as well. So this is pretty average projections here for ERA. And I think a lot of it is because they just don't know what to do with the movement of his pitches or understanding how they would translate over to the majors. So right now he's getting drafted as like the 74th overall pitcher. Again, just under 200 average draft positions. So you can see him right behind Shota Imanaga, and above like Tanner Bybee or Rondon coming off injury, or Cade Horton or Cabrera moving over to Chicago and seeing that. So it's kind of figuring out where this spot, but this whole spot here is really like the last pitchers on your bench. So this wouldn't be like your fantasy frontline starters or even, your main pitchers. This would be like the end of your rotation, depending on how many slots you have for starting pitchers or how many games start your league allows. So this might be someone that you can either, draft really late or potentially monitor and see how they adjust if your league is not deep enough, and they might be on the waiver wire, and just to see how he does. However, I think it is concerning that their projections for his ERA isn't really high. I know one of the advantages that I didn't think about coming into it is in Japan, most of the teams play in a dome. So a lot of the pitchers are a little bit wary of coming to the U.S. and pitching in the open air stadiums to see how their stuff adjusts. That's one of the reasons why Imai signed with Houston, because they play their home games in a dome. So it's a lot easier, or indoor, so it's easier for him to make projections on that. And I think that when you look at like even where Shota Imanaga's projections are as where he's getting drafted pretty similarly, it's also a 4 ERA with like mid 4 FIP, same kind of 8.5 K per 9, and he has a much lower walk rate. So I think he is a little bit more upside with the whip if his walk rate is really that low. So I feel like his current projections are a little bit more, we don't think there's a lot of return on investment for it, because it's probably fairly fair based on what we know right now until we see something. In fact, for that whole series of players in that range, I would actually probably trust Tanner Bybee. I know he didn't have a great year last year, but you can see even with his 4.24 ERA, his expected ERA was still mid-3s, and he's been mid-3s his whole career. So I would actually trust more of a bounce back for Tanner Bybee within that set than taking a risk on any of those other pitchers and so forth, and hope that Cleveland kind of knows what they're doing and can kind of fix them. That's why his projections kind of have, mid to upper 3s, as high as 4 ERA. And then his still strikeout per 9 to be mid-8s, and his walk rate even lower, about one whole walk per 9 lower than what Imai is being projected at right now. So that's why I feel like when you look at where Imai is overall, I think it's actually a fairly fair ranking for him right now until they can figure out where he is and where he should be ranked. So once we see how he responds, maybe he'll jump up a little bit higher if he starts to have a very positive spring training, or if he goes back to the World Baseball Classic and performs very well. But of these 3 players, that's kind of why I presented them in that ranking. I would trust Okamoto to return the highest investment for your fantasy fantasy baseball teams for this year, and the other two you probably want to draft really late or keep an eye on, because they do carry much more risk compared to Okamoto, especially with where the teams that they ended up with. So if you haven't subscribed to this channel, subscribe, and we'll try to help you win your fantasy leagues this year. And you may want to click on one of these suggested videos to watch next.